When considering the theme of madness in Hamlet, and I mean Hamlet the play, not just Hamlet the noble, highly articulate, sensitive prince, or the impotent, selfish waverer, depending on your viewpoints, it's important to recognise that the term has multiple meanings. The most obvious definition of madness for me relates to having a serious mental illness, but the Oxford Dictionary contains two others: extremely foolish behaviour and a state of wild or chaotic activity. This essay will start by considering the circumstances and irritating speeches at the beginning of the play, likely to result in mental turmoil for the tragic hero, even before the appearance of the ghosts, itself an occurrence likely to strain sanity, as Horatio observes, and its disturbing revelations. I will then focus closely on Hamlet himself and explore the effects of the ghost on him and his subsequent behaviour and relationships. To what extent are both Hamlet and Ophelia's mental difficulties accentuated or even caused by the controlling behaviour of those around them? Whilst Ophelia's suicide and pitiful final appearance in Act 4, Scene 5 seem to confirm her madness, how far is Hamlet playing at being mad? Indeed, given that he has had to deal with the trauma of his father's death, his mother's incestuous remarriage, and the supernatural, it would be truly astonishing if he didn't experience a high degree of mental turmoil akin to madness. And what about the views of the other characters on madness, and those they would like to term mad, possibly for their own devious means? So, stay tuned. You're watching a Schofield on Shakespeare A-Level Pre-U revision guide to Hamlet, exploring the theme of madness. There is no doubt that recent past history, public speeches and news of the supernatural combine to put intense pressure on Hamlet's mental health in Act 1. He is first seen famously dressed in black in Act 1, Scene 2, and is present as his uncle cum new and unwelcome father-in-law Claudius addresses the court with an appallingly, brilliantly politic speech. Referring to both the death of his brother and his own marriage, he oozes smarmily. Have we, as 'twere with a defeated joy, with one auspicious and one dropping eye, with mirth in funeral and with dirge in marriage, in equal scale, waiting delight and dole, taken Gertrude to wife? It is impossible not to admire, albeit through gritted teeth, the brilliance of Claudius's rhetoric here, in particular the perfect use of oxymorons. A marriage should, in theory, generate bundles of joy, yet to declare this openly would be inappropriate, and indeed suspicious, given that the previous king and husband died less than 2 months previously. The addition of the adjective defeated falsely implies a degree of resigned inevitability on Claudius's part. He was conquered by whom? Oh so cruel circumstances, into arranging this marriage, whilst the switching of mirth and dirge confusingly smears the boundaries between two entirely separate events: King Hamlet's funeral and Claudius's subsequent usurping marriage. The phrase also uses assonance, as seen in the repeated I sounds, which intensifies the blurring effect introduced by the perverted use of oxymorons. The effect of this, or at least the aim, the listener is lulled into accepting the inevitability and even respectability of Claudius's incestuous actions. Yet, this is an essay, a revision guide on madness. I can hear you crying. What does Claudius's smooth speech have to do with madness? Well, I think it is important, as frankly, from Hamlet's perspective, hearing his uncle somehow seamlessly succeed in justifying the unjustifiable must be utterly maddening. It is one thing to lose your father and then watch your mother marry your uncle, but it is quite enough to have to listen to these events to be implicitly and publicly proclaimed as inevitable consequences of each other. In Branagh's Marathon 1996 film version of the play, this speech is delivered publicly indeed. The wonderful Derek Jacobi plays Claudius and is attired in cheerful military regalia as he brilliantly informs all assembled about the new setup within Denmark's elective monarchy within a splendidly ornate grand hall.
With mirth in funeral and with dirge in marriage, in equal scale weighing delight and dole, taken to wife.
Hamlet is not shown directly at this point, but we see a few minutes later that he has been lingering towards the side of the hall on his own during the King's inaugural speech. Branagh's directorial decision to present this speech in front of such a large, subservient, perfectly ordered congregation, and I choose that biblical word deliberately, accentuates the sense of Hamlet's separation from Claudius's doctored normality. Whereas Hamlet dresses in black with head bowed, everyone else applauds cheerfully and shows their approving acceptance of the new status quo. It is not just Claudius's brilliant public equivocating about his, in Gertrude's later words, "O hasty marriage," which is likely to prove maddening to our dear dark prince. Not only has Claudius taken less than 2 months to marry his brother's wife, but he doesn't even have the decency to behave with the sobriety one would expect from a recently bereaved nobleman. In Act 1, Scene 4, loud blasts from cannons and trumpets indicate that on the same day he gave a speech about defeated joy, dropping eye, and bearing hearts in grief, the new king has decided to indulge in a mammoth drinking session with his cronies. Hamlet reveals, "The king doth wake tonight and take his rouse, keeps wassail, and the swaggering upspring reels. He drains his draughts of Rhenish down." So the king is staying up late into the night, holding a drinking bout, keeping wassail, and treating himself to copious amounts of downed Rhine wine. Hamlet's disdain for such poor-time decadence is seen in the scornful adjective swaggering to refer to the king's wild dances, and the fact that he points out that such behaviour appertains to a custom more honoured in the breach than in the observance. Branagh utilises the opportunities of switching and cutting between scenes facilitated by film to show Claudius sinking cups of wine as Hamlet explains the abhorred tradition to Horatio.
The king doth wake tonight and takes his rouse, keeps wassail and the swaggering upspring reels, and as he drains his draughts of Rhenish down, the kettle drum and trumpet thus bray out the triumph of his pledge.
Is it a custom?
Aye, marry is't. To my mind, though I am native here and to the manor born, it is a custom more honoured in the breach than the observance.
The addition of Claudius and Gertrude being led to their chamber and collapsing on their four-poster bed accentuates the impression the audience have of moral laxity and foreshadows Hamlet's unhealthy preoccupation with his mother's sexuality, which comes to the fore in Act 3, Scene 4. For if Claudius and Gertrude are regularly and publicly showcasing their sexual desire for each other like starstruck teenagers, no wonder Hamlet feels so isolated and so much more prone to mental instability. In 1976, the French rock star Johnny Hallyday released a rock opera based on the play, which at the time was a commercial disaster. I rather like the album. Halliday goes one step further than both Shakespeare and Branagh in depicting the king's dissolute character, which Hamlet finds so disgusting. The fifth track of Disc 1 is bluntly entitled L'Orgie. Have a listen to the second verse.
Le vin court et l'orgie s'attise. Les rires deviennent gras comme des porcs. Les voiles de taille font du striptease. Le noir devient multicolore.
The imagery of mourning veils doing a striptease is particularly wonderful and striking, and highlights the rapidity with which responding respectfully to death has given way to sexual titillation and debauchery, whilst the simile, les rires deviennent grasses comme des porcs, the laughs become as fat as pigs, suggests that the members of the Danish court, the new king in particular, have metamorphosed from civilised human beings to filthy, grunting beasts, and foreshadows the similar language used by Hamlet when speaking to his mother in Acts 3, Scene 4 of Shakespeare's play. I've previously alluded to Hamlet's raw isolation, seen particularly in Act 1, Scene 2 of Shakespeare's play, making him particularly vulnerable to introspective turbulence and angst, and this is shown especially during his first soliloquy within the same scene. He reveals that he has contemplated suicide. Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannon against self-slaughter. In this quotation, Hamlet first expresses a desire for his body to dissipate into drops of water, before going on more explicitly to rail limply against the sixth commandment from the book of Exodus in the Bible, "Thou shalt not kill," which in Elizabethan times would equally have meant you shouldn't kill yourself or others. Whether or not Hamlet thinks suicide is a genuine option for him is difficult to discern, and will vary according to the production. For example, whether he's poised with a weapon, say, as he delivers the words. However, given that he contemplates it again in his famous speech of Act 3, Scene 1, there is no question that his mind frequently considers what the majority of us would call extremely foolish behaviour, our second definition of madness, and that he is mentally volatile. The reference to solid flesh melting is an interesting one, which sheds light on Hamlet's attitude towards the human body, which in turn may provide insight into the cause of his mental angst. Throughout the play, Hamlet seems unhealthily obsessed with human body and flesh, his mother's in particular. In Act 3, Scene 4, he repeatedly conjures up imagery of his mother's sweaty body having sex with his uncle, rank sweat of an enseamed bed, honeying and making love over the nasty sty. Do not let the bloke king tempt you again to bed. Whilst in Act 4, Scene 3, he confrontationally calls Claudius his dear mother, which he justifies by referencing the biblical notion of man and wife being one flesh, thus showing a morbid preoccupation with the orgasmic sexual unity that is sanctioned in marriage. Yes, one can quite imagine a son being none too impressed, disgusted even, by a mother's rapid remarriage, and all that implies on the sexual front. Yet the sheer number of derogatory comments about sex, the body, and human flesh may reflect repressively puritanical views on Hamlet's part. So Hamlet's wish for his flesh to melt away may both indicate philosophical disillusionment with existence, but also suppressed guilt at the desires of his own flesh, which Oedipus theorists would argue are directed towards his mother, but which I, and maybe Branagh, directing his 1996 movie version of the play, would suggest are aimed at Ophelia. Is it preposterous to suggest that Hamlet may feel guilty about some out-of-wedlock nookie with Ophelia, which combines with intense sorrow for the loss of his father and fury at the subsequent marriage to make him on the verge of genuine madness? It is unclear in the original play whether Hamlet has had sex with Ophelia, although the latter's mad singing in Act 4, Scene 5 describes feelings of shame held by women who give in to male desires for sex outside wedlock, and it is not unreasonable to suggest that Ophelia may be referring indirectly to herself. In Branagh's production, the pair have had sex, which is shown via the cinematic technique of flashback, repeatedly exposing mid-shots of passionate moments.
I do know when the blood burns how prodigal the soul lends the tongue vows. These blazes, daughter, giving more light than heat, extinct in both, even in their promise, as it is a making, you must not take for fire.
If we agree that the pair have already had sex, instigated not just by physical lust, but by genuine, deep feelings of love prior to Polonius and Claudius's medley, then it is surely not too much of a leap to suggest that the pair's feelings of loss and guilt exponentially increase their mental distress, which combine with other factors to leave them struggling to maintain mental good order. One factor which contributes to Hamlet's mental turmoil is the role of the supernatural and the appearance of his father armed to the teeth as a ghost. Even before old Hamlet has made his demand for his son to revenge his foul and most unnatural murder, concern has been raised about the potential of the supernatural to wreak havoc upon the human mind. Horatio, who has alerted Hamlet to the haunting presence of the ghost around the ramparts of Elsinore Castle, begs his fellow student not to follow the apparition. He cries, "What if it tempts you toward the flood, my lord, or to the dreadful summit of the cliff that beetles o'er his base into the sea, and there assumes some other horrible form which might deprive your sovereignty of reason and draw you into a madness?" The concern is clearly that the ghost may be the devil, who might whip Hamlet up into a temporary state of madness, resulting in the latter jumping off a high cliff to his death, thus losing his soul to hell. Edgar uses similar phrasing in King Lear when he tries to inject a will to live in his tired, blind, defeated father by claiming that he has fallen from the dead summit of this chalky bourne and survived and escaped some fiend with 1,000 noses in the process. In both plays, the men do not go anywhere near cliff edges, although one believes he has done, and in both cases the proposed chain of events are devil meets human, human goes mad, human attempts suicide. Of course, Edgar is being rather disingenuous because Gloucester was the driving force behind the believed to be a suicide attempt, with the devil figure a mere descriptive perspective abuser. But this loving deceit is partially successful in transforming his father's own vision of himself from battered by human devil's victim to conqueror of the devil hero, at least before King Lear enters, clearly as mad as a hatter himself. But Gloucester's credulity in King Lear gives insight into Elizabethan fears about the devil, madness and suicide. And so when in Hamlet, Horatio delivers these lines about the ghost possibly drawing his friend up to the summit of a cliff into madness, it is clear that he feels this is a genuine, terrifying possibility. The urgency of Horatio's fears come across in Branagh's production. Horatio pulls Hamlet towards him, eyeballs bulging, enunciation accentuated.
What if it tempt you toward the flood, my lord, or to the dreadful summit of the cliff that beetles o'er his base into the sea, and there assume some other horrible form which might deprive your sovereignty of reason and draw you into madness? Think of it!
Horatio is wrong, of course, but only partly wrong. The ghost doesn't want to tempt Hamlet into suicide, but it does draw him unwittingly closer to the jaws of madness. Following the ghost's exit in Act 1, Scene 5, Hamlet makes this vow: "Yea, from the table of my memory, I'll wipe away all trivial fond records, and sores of books, all forms, all pressures past, and thy commandment all alone shall live within the book and volume of my brain, unmixed with baser matter." In other words, Hamlet will completely obliterate from his mind, learning from books, previous impressions and past experiences to focus wholly and utterly on the ghost's commandment. And note the religious connotations of this noun, also suggesting the seriousness of the task in hand. Such an all-devouring vow, albeit an understandable one, is unlikely to result in balanced sanity. Johnny Halliday in Hamlet Halliday extends this idea further. The 7th track from the first disc is entitled Je effacerai de ma mémoire, I will erase from my memory. Have a listen to the 4th verse.
De ma mémoire, tous mes souvenirs d'amour. Depuis mon dernier je t'aime, jusqu'à mon premier toujours.
In this interpretation, Hamlet states explicitly that he will forget about the notion of love, which presumably means that he is hell-bent on putting aside his feelings for Ophelia so that he can wholeheartedly pursue the idea of avenging his father's death. In Shakespeare, the avowal is not so explicit, more about what he will focus on rather than what he will forget, but the net result is the same. Prioritising of revenge above human relationships causes severe mental strain for all involved, especially for Hamlet, whose personality is inclined towards introspection ahead of vigorous action. Let's consider Hamlet's mental state following his encounter with the ghost. He's likely to share contemporary views about the potential links between the supernatural, insanity and suicide, thus making an encounter with a ghost whom he believes is the spirit of his dead father even more unsettling. He's found out that Claudius killed his father, and so had his suspicions about the former's character confirmed in the most dreadful way. He's had to endure the nauseating sights and sounds of his mother and uncle's thrilling new relationship. He's just vowed to annihilate past memories in favour of a single-minded, all-engulfing pursuit of revenge. And there are hints that he may repress puritanical feelings, and he has no means of unburdening himself due to his isolated position. This is unquestionably a man whose mental equilibrium is disturbed. And so, unsurprisingly, when Hamlet is met by relieved Horatio and Marcellus, his language seems erratic and bizarre. He uses imagery to mimic Horatio's cries out for him and liken him to a falcon before issuing these confused, frantic words. Why, right, you are in the right, and so without more circumstance at all, I hold it fit that we shake hands and part. You as your business and desire shall point you, for every man has business and desire, such as it is, and for my own part, look you, I'll go pray. Hamlet starts these lines by agreeing with Horatio's point that a ghost isn't needed to affirm Claudius's wickedness. But whereas in earlier exchanges, Hamlet didn't need a second invitation to make withering comments developing ideas about the new king's immorality, here he hurriedly suggests that they should shake hands and part before stating that he is going to pray. His abstract waffle about every man having business and desire are reminiscent of Polonius spouting superfluous nonsense to the king. And Polonius is a man Hamlet despises. And overall, the impression the audience, Horatio and Marcellus have is of a chaotic, disordered mind. Horatio tells his good friends as such, "These are but wild and whirling words, my lords." Hamlet then goes on to tell his friends a minute later that his plan is to put an antic disposition on in order to conceal his knowledge of Claudius's guilt and his plans. The question is, has he already been practicing this mad persona on Horatio and Marcellus, or has he flipped suddenly from trauma-induced jabberer to clearer thinker, sane man of action with a plan? The answer, as ever with these things, is likely to vary something between the two, and the audience's view is likely to vary slightly according to production. Let's put aside Branagh's 1996 Hamlet for one moment and look at a 2015 film version based on a critically acclaimed production at Manchester's Royal Exchange Theatre, directed by Margaret Williams. Maxine Peake, a woman, plays the title role. Have a look at the moment Horatio realises that the mind of his good friend is all over the place.
I have sworn.
My lord!
Lord Hamlet! So be it.
Your...
How is my noble lord?
What news, my lord?
Ah, wonderful!
Good, my lord, tell it.
You will reveal it.
Not I, my lord, by heaven.
Not I, my lord. How say you then? What heart of man once think it? But you'll be secret.
Aye, by heaven, my
By
lord.
heaven, my lord. There's never a villain dwelling in all Denmark, but he's an arrant knave.
These are but wild and whirling words, my lord.
As is invariably the case with the play, Branagh's film being the notable exception, cuts have been made, and Horatio's reference to wild and whirling words comes immediately after Hamlet's teeth-gritted declaration that there's ne'er a villain dwelling in all Denmark, but he's an arrant knave. This sharply contradicts Shakespeare's original intention, in which Hamlet and Horatio once again share an understanding that Claudius is a bad 'un. The effect of this cut? Well, the onus shifts onto the actor's body language, her tone of voice, her acting to come across as wild and whirling rather than the language itself. When Maxine Peake's Hamlet cries, "Oh, wonderful!" the O extends into a sarcastic crescendo, her arms outstretched and her head tilts towards the heavens. Such a positive adjective to describe a meeting with an armed-to-the-teeth apparition is certainly unexpected, and Peake accentuates the incongruity with her mocking tone of voice and over-the-top body language. Frankly, such melodramatic acting is needed because beyond the bizarre adjective choice and hesitant question about whether the two men can keep a secret, Peake's Hamlet doesn't really have any wild and whirling words to deliver due to the cuts made to the script. This has the effect of making Hamlet seem less mad, but ironically more likely to experience mental difficulties due to the increased isolation of his position suggested by Horatio's inability or timid refusal to empathise with this implied description of Claudius. In Act 2, Scene 1, Ophelia describes an encounter with Hamlet to her father, which presumably has taken place soon after the prince's meeting with the ghost. Once again, there must be ambiguity about whether Hamlet is playing at being mad and cynically using Ophelia as a useful pawn to spread the message of his lunacy, or whether he is genuinely suffering and seeking support from the girl he loves during this terrible period of emotional turmoil. Ophelia reveals that Hamlet came to her, pale as his shirt, his knees knocking each other, and with a look so piteous in purport, as if he had been loosed out of hell to speak of horrors, he comes before me. Whilst it is possible that Hamlet is already putting on his antic disposition, I'm not convinced that this fits in with what we have found out about his character. Hamlet's grim determination to follow the ghost's commands in spite of misgivings, his empathy for the ghost's suffering, his loyalty and friendship with Horatio, his desire to remain respectful towards his mother in spite of her marriage, and his belief in moderation over excess paint an overall picture of a man with a well-defined moral compass, a man who believes strongly in what is right and what is wrong. And so when Hamlet comes to Ophelia shaking, with a fear-struck white face soon after finding out from an apparition that his father has been murdered, it seems far more likely that he is doing so out of a genuine, desperate desire for emotional support. But of course, Ophelia has been forbidden by her father from even speaking to Hamlet, let alone providing emotional support. Bereft of Ophelia's care, Hamlet is left even more isolated and even more prone to madness. The meddling of male family figures plays a key role in the deterioration of the mental health of both Ophelia and Hamlet. I've already alluded to Polonius's instructions for Ophelia not to give words or talk with the Lord Hamlet, but actually it is Laertes who first pokes his nose into his sister's business to offer misogynistic words of wisdom. At the beginning of Act 1, Scene 3, he claims an insight into Hamlet's feelings for her. For Hamlet and the trifling of his favour, hold it a fashion and a toy in blood, a violet in the youth of primy nature, forward not permanent, sweet not lasting, the perfume and suppliance of a minute no more. According to Laertes, Hamlet's attention is merely frivolous, trifling, and originates from short-lived lustful desire, a toy in blood. Like a flower, it will soon wither and pass away. Ophelia listens attentively and dutifully to her brother, but with hindsight, the claustrophobic, repressive demands of her brother and father contribute sharply to her downfall. For in the play, Ophelia ends up even more isolated than Hamlet. She's clearly close to Laertes, but he leaves at the end of Act 1, Scene 3, only to return moments before her death. Her father is far too caught up with the excitement of spying on Hamlet and speculating erroneously about the very cause of Hamlet's lunacy to spend much time with his daughter. even when Horatio tells the Queen of Ophelia's mental troubles. The former's initial reaction is, "I will not speak to her." And so when Ophelia learns of her father's death, this throws an already vulnerable, unsupported, oppressed by patriarchal demands young woman over the edge. In Act 4, Scene 5, Horatio describes her behaviour thus. She speaks much of her father, says she hears there's tricks in the world, and hems and beats her heart, spurns enviously at straws, speaks things in doubt that carry but half sense. The reference to tricks in the world suggests disillusionment on Ophelia's part about the natural justice of society, possibly one in which male family members can put constraints on females but then abandon them. The spurning enviously at straws indicate that she has become consumed and embittered by the pettiness of everyday minutiae and spitefully seizes every opportunity to take out her feelings on others. Would Ophelia have disintegrated so rapidly if she had been permitted to pursue a mutually rewarding relationship with the Prince Hamlet, rather than have her soul and instinct crushed by the decrees and so-called advice from her brother and father? The great irony and tragedy of Ophelia's madness and subsequent suicide is that it is caused to a significant extent by the misguided attempts of men to protect her. When Ophelia does enter the stage in Act 4, Scene 5, her appearance and apparently erratic, inappropriate songs reveal signs of genuine madness. The stage directions state that her hair is down and her songs follow a traditional ballad metre, oscillating fitfully between her two insanity-inducing obsessions, her love for Hamlet, who caused the death of her father. In her first song, Ophelia sings, "How should I your true love know from another one, by his cockle hat and staff and his sandal shoon?" The first rhetorical question seems a conventional reflection on the difficulties in establishing whether a lover is true and genuine, whilst the reference to cockle hat, staff and shoon are far more oblique, thus giving an impression of troubled intellect. However, further analysis suggests that Ophelia may be referring to both Gertrude and Hamlet in these lines. Religious pilgrims would carry a staff and wear sandals and a cockle hat. At this point in the play, Hamlet has been sent on a journey to England following his sinful, mistaken slaughter of Ophelia's father. So is Ophelia thinking of Hamlet when she considers whether a pilgrim's attire should indicate faithfulness in love, something which she has not experienced, partly due to her family's meddling and which is tearing her apart? Alternatively, Ophelia's song starts following Gertrude's question. How now, Ophelia? Could this question be commenting cryptically on Gertrude's rapid reloving following the death of King Hamlet? If love can bud so rapidly, was it ever true in the first place? In the 2015 film version with Maxine Peake as Hamlet, Ophelia's madness manifests itself in the disturbed shedding of her clothing. With Claudius now on stage, she sings distractedly about the sexual consummation of love.
Tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day, all in the morning betime, and I made a your window to be your Valentine. Then up he rose, adorned his clothes, and jumped the chamber door, let in the maid, and out the maid, never departed more.
Pretty Ophelia.
He did it out to know they'll make an end on it.
The contrast between Ophelia's description of the traditional love-making of Valentine's Day and her own abandoned position as Hamlet's sweetheart is tragic. The second verse of the song describes the satisfied male lover getting up from bed to put his clothes back on, whilst a reference to a maid never departing the chamber door indicates that the woman is no longer a maid as she has lost her virginity. There is a great irony in Margaret Williams's production. As Ophelia talks of the man getting up and donning, i.e. putting on his clothes, she determinedly begins to pull off her blouse and then her shirt, leaving her in just a bra. One obvious effect of this is to highlight Ophelia's madness. It is generally considered a bit potty to rip off clothing in public, especially in front of a king and a queen. However, this action may imply a defiant acknowledgement of past sexual activity, presumably with Hamlet. Here's the body that Hamlet previously savoured and deflowered. He, or she in this production, left me now, and I'm just going to show everyone now that I don't care what anyone thinks of me or what I've done in the past. Certainly, Ophelia's later quoting of "before you tumbled me, you promised me to wed," within the disguised framework of a song, with tumbling meaning taking my virginity, seems to imply that she did sexually consummate her relationship with Hamlet. This sexual consummation, followed by apparent abandonment, confirmed by the brazen response of the male lover in the song, has left her feeling embittered, and is combined with the death of her father and the lack of any emotional support to create her madness. Whereas the content of Ophelia's songs provide insight into the probable causes of her own deeply personal mental anguish, Hamlet uses language to both give an impression of madness and to attack the flaws and vanity of others. Ophelia's madness is inward-facing, whilst Hamlet can use his feigned madness and troubled mind to unsettle those he dislikes. In Act 2, Scene 2, Hamlet deliberately unsettles the snooping Polonius, who has taken it upon himself to get to the bottom of the troubled prince's so-called madness. After labelling him a fishmonger, Hamlet goes on to state, "For if the sun breed maggots in a dead dog, being a good kissing carrion, have you a daughter?" The fishmonger label is intended to prick Polonius's pompous sense of self, whilst also drawing attention to his treatment of Ophelia. He is prepared to interfere and sell his daughter's honour, just as a fishmonger sells fish. But of course, randomly calling Polonius a fishmonger out of the blue can easily and conveniently be interpreted as madness, even if coherent resentment and anger lie behind an apparently erratic, bizarrely aimed term. For, unlike Ophelia, Hamlet remains in comparative control of his verbal exchanges. When he refers to the sun breeding maggots, and in doing so, he is reflecting contemporary views that maggots reproduced following some particularly strong sunbeams, before breaking off and asking whether he has a daughter, it initially appears as though he is talking nonsense. But closer analysis reveals Hamlet's sharp intelligence and ability to manipulate language and syntax. The sudden, apparently witless shift to asking a bleedingly obvious question forces the link between conception, i.e. sex, and Ophelia, thus suggesting Hamlet may be taunting the old peddler for past sexual intimacy enjoyed by himself with his daughter, which has been so cruelly terminated. Polonius's responses show that he doesn't understand the majority of Hamlet's allusions, which in a way suits Hamlet perfectly. Polonius can pass on messages to the king confirming Hamlet's madness, whilst the latter is able to obliquely insult his loved one's father to his heart's content without fear of anything approaching retribution. But the audience and the critical reader may consider Hamlet's words further. I've previously explored the idea that Hamlet may be unhealthily obsessed with flesh and the human body. Isn't there something dark and disturbing about referencing maggots, dead dogs, and a woman he genuinely loves within the same sentence? The imagery is disgusting, whilst even the reference to a dead dog being a good kissing carrion, a piece of dead flesh good for kissing, sullies the conventionally positive and relatively innocent associations of human mouth-on-mouth contact. Whereas Polonius may conclude from all this that Hamlet is mad, we as readers may be more inclined to think that Hamlet is being horrifyingly coherent, and in doing so unwittingly providing insight into his own warped view of human relationships and sex. Indeed, could Hamlet's mind be fundamentally perverted, thus making a troubled mentality far more likely than for other characters in the play? Hamlet also talks enthusiastically of maggots to the king later in the play. But whereas the references to maggots when speaking to Polonius help Hamlet taunt him about dark sexual desires for Ophelia, In Act 4, Scene 3, they help him underline the futility of human pride due to social status. In both cases, the apparently random references give Hamlet the convenient cover of madness. Hamlet has been summoned to the king following his killing of Polonius and is asked by Claudius where Polonius is. Let's return to Branner's production to look more closely at this.
Now, Hamlet, where's Polonius? At supper. At supper? Where? Not where he eats, but where he is eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are e'en at him. Your worm is your only emperor for diet. We fat all creatures else to fat us, and we fat ourselves for maggots. Your fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service. 2 dishes but to 1 table. That's the end.
Hamlet's predilection for negative sentence constructions must make him an infuriating person to converse with. In response to Claudius's straightforward questions, Hamlet replies, not where he eats, but where he is eaten. And this propensity to first outline an incorrect answer before apparently given the correct one makes his dialogue harder to follow and thus easier to potentially dismiss as symptomatic of mental disorder. In this particular example, he shows once again an unhealthy preoccupation with the more sordid aspects of existence. Polonius has been eaten by maggots, or will at some point be, as he is now dead and will end up buried in the grounds. This is a fate that will befall all human beings, whether they are fat king or lean beggar. And so the implication is that a sense of self-importance inspired by social status is ultimately futile. We'll all end up in the same place, with maggots nibbling away at our dead flesh, regardless. Claudius's response to these words is a convenient alas, alas, which is intended to indicate sorrow at Hamlet's tragic loss of his mental faculties, but also conveniently allows him to ignore fairly obvious insults, both in the form of abusive labels and barbs intended to deflate his sense of self-satisfaction. A fictional newspaper review of Hamlet within the Canadian writer Carol Corbell's novel In the Wings adds further insight to the advantages of the madness Hamlet adopts. It states, "We all like the idea of madness. We all put on an antic disposition when it suits us. And it suits us, you know, when we have something we need to say that the world, in its conventions, whatever they may be, won't allow us to say." Whilst I agree with the idea that an eccentric persona can allow you to get away with more verbal unconventionality, I'm not convinced that all of us adopt this approach in order to, for example, prick the self-importance of, well, pricks like Claudius. Nonetheless, these words highlight the benefits of Hamlet's decision to put an antic disposition on. It allows him to do something he has been keen to do throughout the play, vigorously insult those he despises. So Hamlet's command of language throughout the vast majority of the play implies that, although he may be deeply troubled, he has most certainly not lost his mental faculties. Thus, in Act 5, Scene 2, he is surely being disingenuous, or probably downright dishonest, when he brazenly asks for pardon from Laertes and explains away grievous past actions as madness. Hamlet may have found Claudius's opportunism, pomposity, disinterest in appropriate mourning rites and relationship with his mother maddening. He may have a warped attitude towards sex, the human body and death, likely to cause a degree of mental angst, repressed desire and guilt. His relatively isolated position and brooding, overthinking personality traits make him more prone to unhealthy introspection. His encounter with the supernatural may unsettle him a great deal, but I do not feel at any point he is outright mad, unlike poor Ophelia, who finds herself the victim of patriarchal repression, messed up views of female sexual desire, and is never permitted to experience potentially reinvigorating changes of scene. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production exploring the theme of madness in Hamlet, in an essay aimed particularly at helping pupils take A-level or pre-U English literature. Many thanks for watching.